Welcome to Beyond the Riverwalk, the local weekly podcast that brings San Antonio's most remarkable people, places, and events directly to you. All links discussed will be in the show notes, so sit back, relax, and join Kevin and Melissa Barron as they ask the questions that you would. Now, let's get the conversation started.
So welcome, Dr. Winters. It is good to talk to you. Thank you for being on the show. It's a thrill for me to learn a little bit more and to do it from someone who's such an authority.
Thanks for reaching out to me. And, many people think of San Antonio as, well, it's where visitors come. But there's so much here for visitors, but also for the people that are in San Antonio, that born and raised here. And so anything we can do to give them some more information to say this is an important place where you live, and we want you to really appreciate it. We love opportunities like that.
Well, that's exactly what we're going for. So thank you very much. Well, I guess I've looked at a little bit of your background, so I'll kind of toss a little bit out there for folks that are listening. You've been the official historian and curator for the Alamo since 1996. I saw that you'd earned a doctorate from TCU. You've been an author, a speaker, an educator, and on one of the YouTube videos I watched a little bit about one of your talks, an actor, I guess, because you're an extra in the IMAX film down at the Alamo or down at the River Center.
We were extras, and then was in Michener's, Texas, which was on television.
Wow.
And we were elevated to quality background artist.
Oh, hey.
And but I did a lot of reenacting, some war reenacting and things like that. And it was opportunities presented themselves to do things like that, and so we did them.
Well, I want to ask you a little bit about that, because my dad was into that with Civil War reenacting back in the 60s. But I guess to kind of get started, you've been into history and interested in history, I guess, from very, very early age. What piqued your interest?
I think two things. One was I came from a family that was interested in history and were avid readers. So reading is one of those ways that young people can access history without, waiting for it to be presented to them in a classroom in a sort of unappealing way. The other is I had the opportunity to live in some interesting places as a child because my father was in the Air Force. And so for a while we lived in Colorado, and I had Pikes Peak just in our backyard. And so I would look there and I'd wonder, who's this Pike guy? And so it led to, that part of history. And what the subdivision we lived in was pretty much brand new, built in the mid-50s. And they had three styles of houses, but they were all built like little Mexican, it was built like a pueblo, where all the houses were stucco, and they had canales coming off of them. And so it was like growing up in a pseudo-Mexican village. But then we got transferred to St. John's, Newfoundland. And so, we were there on the coast. We'd go to the harbor. It was just a different place. But we eventually wound up in, when my father retired, I grew up in Kentucky. And, it's full of history, too. So it's all these things, sort of international history and regional history, and it all came together. So that's one thing that somewhat sets me apart, is that I look at history and go, it's all connected. And so if you're studying U.S. history, if you're studying Texas history, you have to realize that part of it is indigenous, part of it is Spanish, part of it is from the United States, part of it's what becomes Mexico. And so if you really want to understand it, you have to be open to learning about all those different things that we sort of separate and go, oh, this is Native American history, or this is Hispanic history. It all crosses over. It's all connected. Often the people that are involved certainly the ideas are universal. And so it's, how do you tell, when it comes to the Alamo, for example, how do you make it more than just a 13-day battle? How do you reach people to say, this battle is important? You may not recognize that. Let me tell you something that will get you to that point. And the first part is that the Battle of the Alamo isn't really over who controls the Alamo, but it's over who controls the city of San Antonio. And if you say that to a lot of visitors, they'll say, what city are you talking about? And you're going, San Antonio de Bejar, directly across the river from the Alamo. And it's the town that is important. So important that there are two battles in the Texas Revolution. One in December of 1835, and then the more famous one in 1836. But it's who controls the town of San Antonio. And the reason is because it's a strategic crossroads. It's a commercial center. It's where the military garrisons normally are. It's all these things that make it important. So in the Texas Revolution, that's why the rebels come and capture it. Because it's still important, that's why that's why Santa Ana comes back and recaptures it. So there's a logic. And so the idea we often have of something like the Battle of the Alamo is that it's these white people who come in from the United States, and then you've got brown people. So it's often cast in sort of a racial of conflict. But when you start looking at it again through the eyes of the ideology, what you find is, there's a much bigger story here. And there's a story that resonates not necessarily just in 1836, but it goes back to the American Revolution and before that, and it continues through even the events that are happening today. And so, we think of the time that we live in as being the present, but it's the present is future history, and so it's a way of how you make sense about the world you live in by understanding history.
Well, in participating as a reenactor, this is one of the things I wanted to ask you about. What do you think that experience brings to your view on history that maybe the rest of us who haven't done that, don't have?
It's been very important to me. I think it made me a better historian, made me a better writer. I taught in public schools for 10 years, and I started off teaching in science, and you would have the textbook lessons, but then you would have a laboratory. And what living history became for me was the laboratory portion of studying history. So you would read about it, and then you would go, oh, man, sleeping in the cold and wet, it really is miserable.
That'll teach you something different, that's for sure.
Going to Vicksburg in the summer in a wool uniform, it's like, you know what? Mosquitoes can bite through wool blankets.
That's right.
And so you're there and you're going, mosquitoes are killing me. And so you wrap up the blanket and then you're going, oh, I'm so hot, I have to. But it's the camp life. I was always interested in the military tactics, and it's a laboratory. Where else can you get hundreds of people together, some places thousands of people together, and recreate that sort of experience? And part of it was, there are people that go into it because they don't golf, and this becomes their way of escaping. And but for many people that like history, this is the closest way I'm going to kind of understand what it was like. And we've been at events where people were injured, And when that happens, you get this idea of, wow, this is for real. Or we've been in events where people had died. And like I said, the rain, the snow, the heat, and all that, it appeals to people's senses, I believe, that it makes history come alive because you can feel that aspect of it, of being in the elements.
Yeah, and reading, you talked about reading and how important that is. I remember speaking to a physician friend years ago, and we were talking to a bunch of students, and they asked him, what's the most important thing to do to be a physician? And he said, read. He said, I don't care what you read, just read, because that's how you learn. And, from what you're saying is a similar, I guess, as that foundation, but you can't really learn to feel it, the smells and the senses, the touch and the emotions and the rest of it probably nearly as well as if you're there in that setting. And I think that's one thing that the Alamo does is it when you're there, and I'm sure it will even more in the future. We'll try to talk a little bit if we can about where it's headed. But it just kind of gives you that sense of place that you wouldn't have just reading it or just, seeing a documentary or something.
What I try to tell people, not tell people, what I try to remind them is that the Alamo is a building, and it's iconic, and we come to it. It could be the Alamo. We could be talking about any historic structure or any battlefield or whatever, but it's not necessarily the place that's important. History is about people, and so a historic site becomes the vehicle where you get to talk about the people. How are they different from us? How are they like us? Why were they doing what they were doing? And to reintroduce that human element into the discussion of history. We through the Living History program we have at the Alamo, we have people that we know will come here, and they'll look at the lines in front of the church, and they're going, I'm not going to stand in a line to get inside the church. But they'll come to the back, or they'll go into the plaza where we have some people, and they'll spend 10, 15 minutes talking to somebody about a musket or talking about food preparation, things like that. Well, what these people like. And what we know is because we made their visit a human experience, that they go away going, oh, I like being there, and I want to know more about it. So we had a director once who talked about, we don't want to meet people's expectations. We want to exceed people's expectations. And so that's what we often feel where we've done something well, is that we'll have visitors who come and talk to us, and they'll leave saying, there's a lot more to know about this than I thought. This is much more interesting. And, like, oh, this is, we've had people say, you mean it wasn't a movie?
That's right.
And I was like, well, yes, they made a movie out of it, but no, it's a real historical event. And so that's, the mission that I've been on for all this time is to make the Alamo a real event for people and to say, this is why it matters. And this is why we remember. And we'll have visitors that will come, and essentially what they're saying is, all my life, I have done my duty. I have remembered the Alamo, but tell me what I'm supposed to really remember about it. And so, we've got a good tagline, but there's got to be more than just the tagline. There's got to be an actual explanation of why this is an important place. And one of the interesting things about San Antonio and the Alamo is that you can tell the history of, it sounds so grandiose, but you can tell the history of the world. Well, you can tell the history of the Western world because you can talk about San Antonio being a location where Native Americans would come in their trekking through the Southwest. It was a It was on the seasonal circuit for nomadic Native Americans coming through. It's why, the Spanish chose it. The French coveted Texas and San Antonio. You talk about colonization. You can talk about the Republic of Texas. You can talk about Comanches, and that San Antonio finally becomes safe to live in once the U.S. Army gets here in 1850, because they begin to push the Comanches further to the west. And then you got the Civil War. The Civil War almost starts here with Twiggs' surrender in February of 1861. After that, what you have is San Antonio is a cattle town, where cattle are brought through from South Texas on their way to Kansas. And one of the most interesting things is that in 1876, there was a demonstration of how barbed wire works there in Alamo Plaza. Wow. Because ranchers were skeptical. That wire, that won't keep in Texas cattle. But they built a pen, put a longhorn in there, and they didn't get out. And what that does is spells the end of open range. Not just in Texas, but in the entire West.
Yeah.
And again, you go, wow, that happened right here in San Antonio. And then you can get into San Antonio as the military city, but you begin to look at what we have today. We've got aviation, we've got military medicine. First hospital in San Antonio was there at the Alamo, 1804, I believe, established by the Spanish, right there in the Long Barrack. And so it's layers and layers of history. And so the idea, again, I said, of saying the Alamo's 13 days, that's an important event. But all this that surrounds it, it makes a much more interesting story. I've talked to filmmakers before. Not that I don't want to say I talk to filmmakers. I'm so important, but they'll come to the Alamo, and what I'll say to them is the Alamo needs a Star Wars treatment. That you need to have different episodes where the Battle of the Alamo may be one, but then you have to, then go, all right, this is what happened after. And it becomes a separate story. Plus, you need to have prequels. Who was Davy Crockett?
Yeah.
The battle that I talked about in 1835, what was that about? How does that tie into the Alamo? So telling a much fuller story rather than going, we're going to tell you about these 13 days. It's going to be really important, but that's really all you need to know. There's just so much that can be taught using the Alamo as a platform.
When we moved here, the thing that I wanted to see was, we need to go to the Alamo. It's one of the first places we went. I want to understand a little bit about it, but I think you're probably right. I mean, my experience might be what it was for a lot of folks. Is I thought I knew what I was looking for. We went, we spent a couple hours, we left, and it's like, oh, yep, I was there. I understand it. Now I've been there a lot since, but I've not really looked at it through the lenses that you're talking about. When someone does come for the first time, is there a recommended way or suggestions that you have as to how they start to familiarize themselves?
What I would recommend is that they do some internet research, read some articles, at least, look up and go, who was there, and know about some of the people before you get here, so that it isn't an introduction when you're here, but you already have some background information. We have exhibits. We have, but what I would tell, the real answer to your question is you need to talk to somebody. And we have, it's free to get into the church and to get into the grounds, but we have paid audio tours that go from station to station. So if you want to have that as a teaching mean, you can do that. We have paid tours where a tour guide takes a group around and tells them, or like the fact that we've got living history on the grounds, people that are there, and you can talk to them. One of the things about living history, going back to that, is that people have questions, but sometimes they don't want to ask a question because it's, well, this is going to sound stupid.
Yeah.
Or they have a question, but they don't know how to phrase it. They don't know what to ask. The thing about living history is that the questions, write themselves, what's that? What are you wearing? What are you holding? And so it becomes a natural gateway into starting a conversation. We have visitor service people on the grounds, and I would encourage visitors who come and see somebody that's clearly associated with the Alamo, talk to them. They may not be able to answer your question, but they can send you on to somebody else. But the more human interaction you can have with the Alamo through its personnel, the better your experience is going to be.
What has the view of the Alamo been, and how has that changed in the time that you've seen, and I guess academically as also just popular culture?
All right. Part of it is when I came to the Alamo in 96, we would still get a lot of John Wayne Alamo-based questions. And so you were not necessarily fighting, but you were spending time going, no, that didn't really happen. But it gave you the opportunity to say, but this is what happened. So it was sort of a curse and a blessing at the same time. We're getting people now that are going, I never saw that movie and I don't know who John Wayne is.
Mm-hmm.
But so that part is going away. What we are, in 86, we had the 150th anniversary of Texas independence. And it was one of those times where people were celebrating sort of the traditional story, but because of the civil rights movement and just changes that had taken place, there were also questions about, well, were these people that honorable? Wasn't this really about stealing land? Wasn't this about other things? And so people started writing. Anniversaries tend to birth a lot of books. And so people started writing about historical figures, events. And so that was taking place throughout the 80s. And in the 90s, a lot of these projects that have been influenced by changes in society start hitting shelves. And so things that had been known by academics who are talking to themselves now become available to the general public. And that's the we often get told, I never learned that in school. And the point is, we never really learned that in school either, but we talked about reading, the process of reading. You've got to search information out, and you've got to open yourself to reading. But as you said, how does somebody find that out? You can go to Amazon, just type in something like Texas Revolution or the Alamo, and it'll come up and show you more or less chronologically of what's recent, what was, from the 90s, what was from 1959. That would be Lon Tinkle's book. But if you are interested, the information is available. And what I would say is is contact the Alamo and say, is there a reading list that you would recommend? Because we do have those, and we can get people started. And what we try to do is, again, open up. If you want something on Mexican history, we can give you something on Mexican history. If you want something on Davy Crockett, we can give you something on Crockett. But the challenge is, how do you take all these things and weave them together? Now, in another anniversary in 1996 was the 150th anniversary of the beginning of the war with Mexico. And like I said, it produced a lot of interest, produced a lot of books, which I had some that came out at that time. But I was involved in something really incredible. And that was that we began to have conferences where we had American scholars and Mexican scholars getting together, in the same room, presenting papers, but we began to know each other. And the idea of you telling one story and us telling a story that are separate, no, we're telling the same story. We're just weaving in different threads. And that has transferred into the Texas Revolution, where we often get the question, what's the Mexican perspective? And what we'll say is, you mean Santa Anna, president of Mexico? You mean Gomez Farias, the person that was vice president that he kicked out of office because he was an ardent Federalist? And we can name all these names, and we can get to the point where you're going, Stephen F. Austin, Jim Bowie, and they're going, they're not Mexicans. They're Mexican nationalists, because they have been. And so the point we try to make is, do you view the term Mexican as a nationality, or do you view it as a race? Because like I had said, if your idea is it's white people against brown people, we can tell you things that say you might want to reconsider that. And it tells a much fuller story. One of the things that's very interesting that we like to talk about is, in 1838, there's something called the Pastry War. And France was owed money by Mexico, and Mexico didn't have the money. Part of it was that in a few years earlier, there had been a riot in Mexico City, and market stalls had been ransacked, and a French pastry chef submitted a claim to the French government saying my goods were stolen. And so that, it becomes called the Pastry War when the French come to. So I'm saying that, and it's kind of like, well, what's that got to do with the rest of the story? Well, it's the Pastry War that brings Santa Anna back from internal exile. And in 1838, French come, he rushes to the front out of, like I said, self-imposed exile, loses his left leg to a French cannonball. It propels him back into politics. He goes from being the person who lost Texas now to the person who saved Mexico from France. And so it sets him back on the course. Pastry War is also very important because that riot that I talked about, many people don't understand, Santa Anna, and they seem as very opportunistic, because he's on this side, then he's on this side, he revokes the Constitution. And that Pastry War, again, all history is connected. Look at the French Revolution and how it got sort of out of hand and had a phase called the Reign of Terror.
Yeah.
In the United States, in Mexico, in all these countries that were undergoing the change to small r republicanism, the idea was, how far is this going to go? This isn't going to turn into another French Revolution, is it? And that event That riot causes people like Santa Anna, who had supported the Mexican Republic, to go, we've gone too far. This is what it's going to turn into. We need to grab control back from the people. And so this is the spark that where the Constitution of 1824 is revoked and sets not just Texas, but other areas in Mexico on the path of revolution. So, different events, but they're all wrapped up together.
Yeah, and I've not heard that, explained or described that way in the past. And that's, I'm sitting here, the wheels are turning, I'm thinking, wow, I didn't realize. I don't know. It's really making me think. And I guess that's the purpose of all of this. So thank you. Oh, wow.
I've done my job.
That's awesome.
But that kind of gets us to the point where, and to what you had said, if you're thinking, I want to know more about this. I never heard this perspective. Or I've never heard, where do you go from there? When I was teaching, it was often required in teaching that you would write your philosophy of teaching. And what I would always say is that I view my role as a teacher as a guide. That what I'm doing is I'm trying to get you interested, but I'm trying to guide you along the path. And I've benefited from having people guide me, because I certainly, didn't. I know things now I know that I would not have known if I hadn't run into certain individuals or read their works. So it's I'm interested in this. How can I find out more? And like I said, contact the Alamo, and we can certainly recommend some things. Dr. Stephen Hardin, back in '93, I believe, his book that came out on the Texas Revolution was Texian Iliad. And I would recommend that somebody who wants to know about the conduct of the Texas Revolution developed, that would be a good source. My book, which was called, I have to think of it, called Sacrifice at the Alamo.
Yes.
It talks about the political and the societal reasons why there's a Battle of the Alamo. And for many people who have read it, that talk to me, they say, yeah, I never knew there was so much to it. And it's written in a way that is supposed to be readable as opposed to, I'm reading a textbook. Because history needs to be approachable. It doesn't need to be heavy-handed like, you better take notes and there's going to be a test on this.
Yeah.
People pick up on what interests them, and then they'll take it forward. A good book on the Battle of San Jacinto is Stephen Moore's book called 18 Minutes. And if people are interested in work by on Tejanos, Frank de la Tejas, who's the executive director of the Texas State Historical Association, he has books on Seguin, on San Antonio. So it's the people who write about the Texas Revolution in this period. It's a small group, and we're sort of well connected and like family members. So if you get a hold of one person and like them, everybody's very approachable. So we got this thing called email, so contact us.
That's right. Well, and I think that's true. That's one of the things we were thinking about when we were doing this podcast, and we've talked to a lot of different interesting folks. And I was thinking, it's like, it's probably not going to be that easy to get a hold of someone to talk about the Alamo, because it's such a big thing. It's such this cultural icon. I'm sure they have tons of things going on. But the fact that, I got a response that you're willing to do this, to me, says exactly what you're saying. It is approachable. People are willing and interested in teaching about it and learning about it. And hopefully that's the way that we'll understand things more going forward. I guess the question that's been out there, and I've talked to several folks about, was the future of the Alamo. I've seen, different versions of what they're talking about doing to, I don't know if the right word is restore or preserve, but what can you describe, or what can you tell us about what we're going to see, I guess, in the next few years on the Alamo grounds, and how that's going to help to preserve the legacy and to do the teaching that you're talking about?
All right. Let me first say, why people are talking about the need for change. And it's because the Alamo is sort of a victim of its fame, where people will have seen the church in a picture and they think that's all there is to it. And this being Texas, once they get here and they're standing in front of it, they're going, that's it? And they'll say, I thought it would be bigger. So their idea is, I came here, I'm sort of disappointed in what I'm seeing. And the other thing they'll say to us is, how did it get downtown? Instead of understanding that town grew up around it.
Right.
And so part of it is, we need to be able to tell people that it's more than the church. The church is important, but where is the skeleton of the Alamo laying? And then once you've done that, what is the bigger story that you're going to tell? Yeah, you need to be able to honor tradition, to honor the 13-day story, but you need to be able to, like we talked about before, you need to be able to explain it. What's the context for this? Why is this really important? And as we talked about, if you want to understand the Alamo, you got to understand San Antonio. And so it's just, how do you build it into a bigger picture so that when people come here, that physically they go, wow, this is I see the Alamo and it's much bigger than I thought it was, just because there'll be visual clues. And then also, I want to know about the 13 days and the defenders, but all this other information we're telling them helps them understand why it's important and how it's local history, it's regional history, it's international history, and we have visitors from all groups. And so we know that everybody didn't come through the same intellectual window or door. So how can you craft a story so that there are multiple entrances for people? And once they get into the story, they're getting the same story. But how do you make it, again, what we've been talking about, how do you make it accessible? And how do you make it relevant? So it's like, it's not just trivia, it's real world. And, I can see how that happened in the past is relevant to today.
Well, what are people going to see? I mean, what will actually change? Because I can say, just like you noted, the first time I came, I was like, wow, that's really cool to be here. But yeah, that's not what I thought it would be. Now, since we've lived here, I've kind of walked the area, and I've seen some of the foundations of the walls that are pointed out elsewhere. I've seen some of the plans that have been published, but I can't say I can really interpret what's going to be changing. Could you kind of help us with that?
Sure. One of the things that have been somewhat controversial is the idea of moving the cenotaph, or that monument is in the middle of the plaza. And the idea was, can we expand the footprint of the battle? And if we move it the battle didn't just happen on that Alamo compound; it happened all around it. And so, can we move the cenotaph to expand the space? So, in a sense, it becomes what you first see as you approach from the south, sort of as a welcome you. And also, can we enhance the cenotaph? Because we know that there are some names that are misspelled or maybe even missing. Can we describe it not just as a monument, but as an artifact? What does this mean? But then the plaza, when I talk about the plaza, where the bandstand is and that area, that's Valero Plaza. And then there's a series of planters, and when you go north of those, and you're across from the church and the Lawnbreak, then that becomes Alamo Plaza. And the idea is, how do you physically mark the plaza out so that people who are coming know that they're coming into an area that is different, that is special, that they don't have to get to somebody and go, how big was this place? They'll see how big it is or how big it was as they approach. And again, the idea is to make it more visitor friendly. The street closing that will take place in the future, if you've been down there, it's hard to see it as a historic spot when you've got buses and trucks and things going by. If you've ever tried to talk to a group of fourth graders out in the plaza when you've got other things. So it's trying to, how do you make it an educational area? How do you make it a place where it's reverent? And that's what people are going to see.
And there's work that's going to be done, from what I understand, to restore the actual church, because from what I understand structurally, it needs some work. And then across the street, there's, I think it was the old Woolworth building. I don't know if that's going to stay or that's going to go, but I know that I've seen on some plans that that is going to be the site, one way or the other, of a museum that's going to house different types of artifacts and things. Is that accurate?
Yes, several years ago, the state of Texas bought. It looks like one long building, but it's actually three separate buildings. It's on the west side of Alamo North. But there'll be architects that'll be examining that to see what would have to be done to turn that into the museum. And we're kind of in the middle of that, and I can't really
well,
address it much other than to say, it's going on.
Yeah, I'm sure things will change over time.
We've got the Collins collection. We'll likely be acquiring more collections to fill in some gaps that we've got as we go on. What everybody who's part of this project wants visitors to come and not go, oh, is this all there is? But we want the Alamo to have facilities, to have programming that meets, actually, when I go back to what I said, doesn't just meet people's expectations, but exceeds their expectations. That they're going, if you like history, you need to go to Colonial Williamsburg. You need to go to Sturbridge Village. Oh, and you especially need to go to the Alamo.
Yeah.
That's what we're shooting for.
Well, that's a great goal, and I'm sure that's what's going to happen. There's a lot of people working hard on it, I know, and it represents so much to so many people. I think it sounds like, from what you described through our conversation, the representation that it has for all these different people, maybe we'll all find one day that it all just comes together in the middle somewhere, and we're just all looking at it from a different perspective. But you've definitely piqued my interest, and I know you've probably piqued a lot of folks that are listening's interest. So I just wanted to thank you again for taking the time to talk to me today. as well as for just being there and doing the work that you do, because I'm sure a lot of what we've seen over the years and the time that you've been there has been influenced by you and enhanced by you. So thank you for the research and for the writing and for the acting and everything else that you've done to be part of the Alamo story. But I really do appreciate the time.
It's been a pleasure.
Well, and thank you also, everyone, for listening. This is Beyond the Riverwalk, and this is Kevin, and we'll see you around the Alamo City.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of Beyond the Riverwalk. Send your comments, questions, and suggestions to podcast@beyondriverwalk.com. As always, subscriptions to our show are free and available wherever you find podcasts, as well as on our website. Until next week, join us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram for more conversations about our community.
Thank you very much, Dr. Winters. I really appreciate it. I have been a little bit starstruck, believe it or not, in talking to you. I've never met you, but in reading and seeing stuff, I've just been like, oh my gosh, what am I going to ask this man? He knows everything. And I've been kind of tripping over some words here, so I'm sorry about that.
No. That's what we do. That's why we're here. We're here to talk to people.
All right. Well, you have a great weekend and a great week upcoming. Thanks again for your time.
You're very welcome.